Good afternoon, and welcome to True Crime Mysteries. If you are new to the channel, hello and welcome, and if you are returning, welcome back. Today we have the much-requested deep dive on Elizabeth Holmes and her now-defunct company, Theranos. This will be part 1 of 2, but before we get started, just a friendly reminder to like the video if you enjoy the content, and let me know if you want me to cover more deep dives like this one. But with that being said, let's get into it. Elizabeth Holmes, at the height of her career, was everywhere. She was a young, attractive woman who was pioneering a place for women as the CEO of a medical tech startup. Elizabeth, a Stanford dropout, followed in the footsteps of other tech CEOs who rose to the top of the industry, like Steve Jobs and Mark Zuckerberg. You could find her gracing the covers of magazines, attending fancy events, rubbing elbows with the most prominent players in both the government and the Fortune 500. She gave passionate TED Talks. She was a guest speaker at numerous conventions. She was charming, and her deep voice commanded those around her to listen. She captivated audiences and individuals alike. She rose to stardom seemingly overnight, but her meteoric crash land netted her even more infamy, though not nearly as desirable as her prior fame. Her company was built on a foundation of lies, deception, and fraud, and the house of cards she built came crashing down, hard, the consequences of which could land her significant jail time. But let's start from the beginning. Elizabeth Holmes was born in 1984 in Washington, D.C. When Elizabeth was asked what she wanted to be when she grew up, she would say, a billionaire. Her mother was a congressional staffer on Capitol Hill, and her father had been the vice president of Enron until their fraudulent business practices caused the company to go bankrupt. Her father was virtually unemployable for many years, but later worked for various government agencies. When the Enron scandal came to light, the family lost everything.
We are right here outside the old Enron building. Take a look at the front doors here. It's where you may remember employees were seen walking out with their belongings in cardboard boxes. Enron's collapse had lasting impacts here in the U.S.
Then Enron is likely one of the largest corporate scandals in the U.S. history.
Ken Lay started Enron in 1985 as a regional pipeline operation. He turned it into a trading energy company, buying and selling electricity and natural gas. The company's revenue exploded from $5 billion a year to $200 billion a year, with 20,000 employees globally. It became the 7th largest company in the country. But in the process, billions of dollars in debt was kept off the company books, and profits were falsely inflated. Enron filed for bankruptcy on December 2nd, 2001. Fired employees lost billions in retirement and pension funds.
To do this to the employees who were so loyal and dedicated, and this is what we get back for repayment.
Nearly 24 people were convicted or pled guilty to federal crimes. Most notably, Enron CEO Jeffrey Skilling served 14 years in prison. Ken Lay died of heart disease less than 2 months after his conviction. Chief Financial Officer Andrew Fastow served 5 years. It sparked investigations, and Enron's collapse changed how corporate America conducts business.
They were forced to relocate from Washington, D.C. to Houston, Texas, which hadn't been a welcome move. Seeing the stresses of financial ruin, Elizabeth formed many opinions about wealth from a young age. She knew there was a direct correlation between power and wealth early on. Her parents put a lot of pressure on both Elizabeth and her younger brother. They pushed them to both excel academically. There were some big shoes to fill when carrying the Holmes name. Elizabeth's great-great-grandfather had been a famous surgeon, a man who had also married into the Fleischmann yeast empire. It was a point of pride for the family, and it had been very important to them to carry on the legacy. Elizabeth would later tell The New Yorker, "I grew up with those stories about greatness, and about people deciding not to spend their lives on something purposeful, and what happens to them when they make that choice, the impact on character and quality of life." Elizabeth was known for being incredibly devoted to her studies in high school. She had numerous academic and extracurricular activities, and she was fluent in Mandarin by the time she graduated. She also ran track and had a highly regimented lifestyle, but she didn't seem to connect with many of her peers. Many remember her fondly, but no one was really close to the ambitious youth. She became interested in computer programming and had even started a little side hustle of creating programs that translated computer code to universities in China. While still in high school, some strings had been pulled to allow her to participate in a summer program normally held only for Stanford University students. Stanford was the only university that Elizabeth was interested in attending. The summer program brought her to Beijing, and it was there that she would be introduced to a man who would later play a huge role in her life, entrepreneur Sunny Balwani. Sunny was also involved in the program. The 37-year-old struck up a friendship with Elizabeth, who at the time was only 18. Elizabeth looked up to Sunny as a mentor. He had struck gold during the dot-com boom in Silicon Valley and had come out a millionaire. After the summer program, Elizabeth was accepted at Stanford and started her studies in chemical engineering in 2002. She worked as a student researcher and lab assistant there. In the summer after her first year, she was accepted into a research laboratory in Singapore, working on the SARS pandemic. It was through her work there that she became interested in microfluidics. In 2003, she filed her first patent application. She wanted to invent a wearable drug delivery patch. Her first company was founded that same year, called Real-Time Cures. It was there that she had this idea to democratize healthcare. It was her own fear of needles that motivated her to find a solution to traditional blood work, a system that hasn't really had many advances in decades. She had enlisted one of her Stanford professors, Channing Robertson, to help her start things up. He even introduced her to some of her earliest investors. She had been able to secure funding from people who believed in her and her vision. Millions of dollars started coming in. Her company also started to take up a significant amount of time. She stopped going to many of her classes. By 2004, Elizabeth made the decision to drop out of Stanford and pursue her company full-time. And by 21, she had rebranded her company to Theranos, a combination of the words therapy and diagnosis. Her vision for the company had evolved several times in the first few years. The microfluidic patch had been scrapped early on. Now, Elizabeth was focused on creating a device that was similar to the size of a home printer, that would only require a single drop of blood to run numerous tests. This device would enable the user to take ownership over their own body, not having to rely on traditional venous draws and numerous tests. She had big dreams, and compared her device to when home computers became accessible. She wanted one in every home.
So then I just made a decision that I was going to figure out how to make it work. And that was it. And I actually left. I ended up living in the basement of a bunch of Stanford grads and started working from the basement of their house, and then finally convinced someone to give us, originally it was a bridge loan, and then went through the process of starting to build the company.
In less than 6 years, Elizabeth would manage to raise over $92 million in venture capital without any degrees or experience running such a large company. Many venture capitalists involved in the medical tech industry passed on the opportunity, but Elizabeth had a lot of success securing investments among family friends and wealthy families. In 2009, Sunny Balwani joined Theranos as the president and COO, but he wasn't just joining as a partner. He also loaned Theranos $13 million. Sunny didn't have any qualifications running labs, nor did he have any scientific background at all. He had come from a background in tech and had previously worked for Microsoft. And what became a shocking revelation was that Sunny and Elizabeth had been dating since 2003. They had kept their personal relationship a closely guarded secret. Not even their board members had been made aware of the situation. Sunny wasn't positively regarded within the company. Many employees described him as rude, aggressive, terse, and unreasonable. Sonny and Elizabeth ran Theranos as joint partners. Elizabeth handled the press, the big investors, and the big picture side of the business, while Sonny handled the day-to-day operations of the company. Employees quickly caught on that Sonny had very little technical knowledge about the projects they were working on. Sonny would constantly berate employees, even when they did what he asked, and would cause Sonny to frequently blow up and berate staff. This earned him a nickname around the office, the Enforcer. Until Theranos' official launch in 2013, Elizabeth had operated her company under a curtain of secrecy. Citing concerns over trade secrets, it was run in a manner that Elizabeth called stealth mode. Employees signed exhaustive NDAs, and there was a massive legal team at Theranos' disposal to ensure they were held up. There were several waves of hires, and Theranos was growing quickly and needed a large number of scientists to help the technology become functional. This stealth mode meant that departments were kept small and didn't interact with one another. Communication between different departments was left to Elizabeth and Sonny to manage. They were the only two people in the company that had any idea of what everyone as a whole was accomplishing. This was obviously a challenge, as the device had numerous working parts, and having each team separate meant the other teams had no idea if what they were doing was working. Elizabeth knew the power of a good story, and she was very good at selling her company. It was what made her a master of marketing and procured the company billions of dollars in funding. She focused on leveraging loss and grief and pulled at the heartstrings of those who were listening.
I grew up spending summers and the holidays with my uncle. I remember his love of crossword puzzles and trying to teach us to play football. I remember how much he loved the beach. I remember how much I loved him. He was diagnosed one day with skin cancer, which all of a sudden was brain cancer, and in his bones. He didn't live to see his son grow up, and I never got to say goodbye. We define diagnosis today as the determination of the presence of disease from its signs and symptoms. Yet diseases often begin so much earlier than when symptoms first appear. We see a world in which every person has access to actionable health information at the time it matters. A world in which no one ever has to say, "If only I'd known sooner."
The first era of Theranos was called the Apple era, and it was right at the beginning when Elizabeth's obsession with Steve Jobs and Apple started to come full circle. Avi Tevanian had left Apple in 2006 and joined Theranos as a board member later that year. Avi had been the right-hand man to none other than Steve Jobs, where he had worked as the vice president of software engineering. His PhD in computer science made him an incredible asset to the Theranos board. With Avi Tevanian on board, and by extension endorsing Theranos, many other employees of Apple jumped on board immediately after. Anna Ariola had also been hired on as a chief design architect. Ariola had been one of the product designers responsible for designing the Apple iPhone. Ariola was responsible for creating the look and feel of Holmes' product, known as the Edison device. It had also been Ariola's influence that helped craft Elizabeth's signature look. Elizabeth would ask about Steve Jobs' attire. Ariola explained what designer had helped to craft Steve's legendary black turtleneck shirts, and when Ariola next saw Elizabeth, she had switched out the old frumpy sweaters for the much more sleek black turtlenecks, black slacks, and a black blazer. No one could fault Elizabeth for not having passion and drive for her company. She was often the first one in and the last one to leave the office. She lived and breathed Theranos, but fostered a work environment that was unsettling to most. If a department wasn't performing to Elizabeth's expectations, she would often hire an entirely new team to moonlight the first team. She also favored those who showed the same level of dedication as she did to the company. Working only her contracted hours was a sure ticket to get on Sunny and Elizabeth's bad side. Ariola described the work environment as, Elizabeth did not want to hear other people's opinions. She wanted positive results. I think that anyone who told Elizabeth no and disagreed with her perspective and point of view, you were immediately terminated. It was just a very unusual environment. It was an environment that saw a very high turnover in employees, with either numerous terminations with no explanation or people resigning. One such resignation was Avi Tavanian, as well as many of the other Apple recruits. Elizabeth had even fired her chief of finance early on because he wouldn't falsify projections for investors. Sunny took over that role and had no issues bolstering up projections 10 times what they were capable of achieving. The company never rehired a CFO and had gone without one since 2006. Tensions to perform within the company ran high by 2015. The company was making big promises that they were unable to keep, and there was little headway in the devices, despite years of work. Ian Gibbons had been initially hired in 2005 as the chief scientist for Theranos. He had been introduced to Elizabeth through Channing Robertson. The two knew each other from working together at a company called BioTrack. He was highly qualified for the company. He was a biochemist from Cambridge with over 30 years of experience in the industry, but was unable to deliver impossible results to Elizabeth. In 2010, Ian had confided in Channing Robertson about Elizabeth. He didn't agree with her statements to the public that the device worked, and he also didn't agree with the fake demonstrations. He became very concerned, justifiably, about Elizabeth's lies. He was publicly connected to the company, and it was his reputation as a scientist that was on the line. Channing betrayed Ian, relaying his concerns to Elizabeth. He was fired immediately, but after it caused an outcry from his colleagues, he was rehired in a lesser role with reduced responsibilities as the technical consultant to the chemistry department he had once been the head of. In 2011, he learned from the Theranos legal team that he would be subpoenaed to testify as a witness during a patent theft case between Theranos and Richard Fuiss. Gibbons had been listed as a co-inventor with Elizabeth on several Theranos patents. Gibbons had indicated that the Theranos legal team had been coaching him to stick to a certain narrative that Gibbons didn't share. He did not want to lie, and he was anguished that he would face repercussions with Theranos if he didn't comply. The stress consumed him in the days leading up to the court date. The night before the court date, Ian Gibbons self-medicated with a combination of medication and alcohol. His wife found him the next morning barely breathing. He was rushed to the hospital, but died days later of liver failure. Ian's wife called and left a message for Elizabeth to report his death, and was surprised when no one called back. Later that day, she received an email from a Theranos lawyer requesting all of Ian's company property, a laptop, and documents be returned to Theranos immediately, or she would face legal consequences. It had been a shocking response to her husband's traumatic death. Elizabeth and Sunny were looking to attract some more investors in the early 2010s. There was only a slight problem. The technology still didn't work. The Edison device was meant to replace the need for big, bulky medical testing equipment and be an all-in-one solution. Theranos engineers were tasked with the impossible, but that wasn't what Sunny and Elizabeth wanted to hear. Many employees had little to no experience working with biohazards such as blood, and the facilities were not up to code for safe handling or sanitation. In March of 2010, Elizabeth and Sunny approached Walgreens with a proposal. They wanted to put their devices into pharmacies, and they wanted to work with Walgreens. They pitched the Theranos technology as viable, consumer-ready, and that it was comprehensively validated by 10 of the 15 largest pharmaceutical companies. They claimed that they could do 150 tests on a single drop of blood, with hopes of quadrupling that amount very soon. In January of 2012, Elizabeth and Sonny had made commitments to Walgreens, assuring them they would get regulatory approval for the Edison device. The nano container, which was the chamber that stored the blood, had received FDA approval, but Theranos and the FDA had been going back and forth on the classification of the device. Theranos lawyers had discovered a loophole and were able to exploit that and continue operating as if they had the proper FDA approvals. Meanwhile, even though she was facing numerous issues with their facilities, Elizabeth forged on and went forward with patient testing. She did so despite knowing that Edison gave frequent incorrect lab results and knew it was not in a position to be tested on real people who were unaware of the device's margin of errors, results that could be detrimental. One patient who had chosen Theranos due to it being a much cheaper option than traditional blood work was told that she had HIV. It had taken her several weeks to be able to save to get retested, and had been able to confirm her initial Theranos test results had been wrong. Many women received false pregnancy results. One woman got a result that indicated she had miscarried when her baby had actually still been viable. There were over 1 million test results given to patients. Doctors made decisions for medication based on the results and ordered additional, much more costly tests to confirm what lab results had indicated as well. For lab results that couldn't be performed on the Edison, they were performed on traditional lab equipment that had been hacked, for lack of a better word, so that Theranos could use them and study them. It was lab equipment they weren't supposed to have or operate without proper regulatory measures. Theranos was using devices they were not supposed to be operating, and employees were operating them without the proper licenses. The facility was not set up in a way that was safe for employees. There was very little done to protect the integrity of the patient samples. Frequent issues with contamination and mishandling occurred. The labs were frequently described by staff members as a shit show. However, investors had been assured that all of these measures had been taken by the company. Board members and investors were told that Theranos was running a state-of-the-art facility with all of the highest levels of quality assurance. But no one was allowed behind the curtain. Everyone was just operating under the assumption that Elizabeth was being honest and doing what was right.
I think the promise of technology is that we can make access to basic infrastructure and, in many cases, to more advanced infrastructure than is even currently available today in developed economies, available to people who are the most in need, in the same way that cell phones have leapfrogged over the lack of landlines in so many places. And I think the promise of Silicon Valley and these places in the world in which there's so much creativity is that we can demonstrate that there are models for doing well by doing good, and for applying technology and developing technology for those who are most in need. I mean, the best business models now are ones where you're developing goods and services for prices that are lower than those that are subsidized by foundations.
A big problem for Theranos was that Elizabeth ran her company how the leaders in tech that she set out to emulate had run their companies. Apple, Oracle, Facebook, and Microsoft all had one thing in common. They were companies in computer tech. Theranos was different in that it was primarily in the field of medicine. Elizabeth had a charming and captivating personality. Her deep voice and unblinking, bright blue eyes made most people feel as though she had cast a spell on them. It had been this charm that had attracted the all-star board of directors to her as mentors. They all shared similar opinions of Holmes, that she was brilliant, attractive, and would do great things with Theranos.
Could this be the future of preventive medicine? Let's take a closer look with Elizabeth Holmes. She's the founder and CEO of Theranos, who also happens to be the youngest self-made female billionaire in America. Ms. Holmes, welcome to Mad Money.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thank you. All right, Elizabeth, you're doing something that's so profound that you're giving transparency. You're also making it so that it's easier, better for the consumer. There's a little device that you have that I think is the good metaphor to start with. Could you show us and tell us what it is?
Absolutely. So this is what we call the nanotainer, which is a very small tube that's designed to replace the big vials that you take out of your arm when you draw blood traditionally with a tiny drop that can come from a finger.
Okay, so what does this mean for the traditional way we do diagnosis, and how would it upend the paradigm? Because I know you don't want to think small.
The goal is to empower the individual. We believe strongly that the future of healthcare is in enabling the individual to have the information that they need to take ownership of their health, and making lab information, which drives 80% of clinical decisions, more accessible by making it as painless as possible, making it incredibly inexpensive, and providing transparency around pricing so that people know before they buy a healthcare service how much it's going to cost them. We can begin to make it possible to enfranchise the individual and get them engaged.
Early on, Elizabeth had been mentored by Don Lucas, a self-employed venture capitalist who had been investing in Silicon Valley for decades and had once been on the board for Oracle. He took the young entrepreneur under his wing and helped Elizabeth make several connections to other big names. He would also take a seat on the board of Theranos as the chairman. One of those connections was Larry Ellison, the founder of Oracle, a computer tech company that creates and develops various software used worldwide. Ellison played a very important role to Elizabeth. He had directly assisted her in making various decisions, and again helped to get her face-to-face with big investors. He had even given her the advice to not listen to her scientists when they told her things weren't possible. He stated that, if he had listened to every programmer's never-ending complaints, Oracle never would have become the success that it did. But medical science is completely different than computer programming. The two really can't be compared.
People don't even know that they have a basic human right to be able to get access to information about themselves and their own bodies that can change their lives. Every person should have the ability to get that type of test, because if you understand that early that you're at risk, there's a lot more that you can do about it. And we'd like to see a world in which every person gets access to this type of basic testing, and the types of tests that are done are ones that provide insight into the onset of disease in time to do something about it.
Another influential mentor was Tim Draper. He had helped her get investments from the DeVos family, the Cox family, and introduced her to Rupert Murdoch. Draper had been one of the first investors for Theranos. Her board would eventually become full of heavy hitters, like George Shultz, David Boies, Henry Kissinger, Mark LaRey, and General James Mad Dog Mattis, who had served as the Secretary of Defense. A board of directors is meant to hold a CEO accountable. They even hold the power to replace a CEO if they feel they are underperforming or not acting within the best interests of the company. These directors, typically early investors, are usually allowed access to all aspects of the business, but this didn't happen at Theranos. When asked to see contracts, audits, or lab results, Elizabeth would either directly shut down their request, citing excuses like, "No, that is under legal review," or she would skirt around the questions, promising to produce results before the next quarter. What was missing from Theranos' stacked board of directors were any experts relating to the field of medicine, science, or biology. With perhaps the one exception, Channing Robertson. Robertson was one of Elizabeth's teachers at Stanford, and she had worked for him on some projects. When she left Stanford, he had been one of the first recruits that Elizabeth had sought out for her board. Robertson was paid hundreds of thousands of dollars as a salaried employee, but claimed that despite him having an office and regularly working at Theranos more than any other board member, he had no idea about the third-party devices or the false promises Elizabeth had made. In 2016, Theranos announced a new panel of medical and laboratory experts would be joining the board. Susan Evans, William Fogey, Anne Gronowski, and David Halfett were scheduled to join, but by the time the announcement was made, it was likely already too late. In 2015, things started to take a turn for Theranos. People started looking at Theranos more critically. They had been making bold claims and had yet to publish any literature to back them up. Their revolution in medical tech needed to be peer-reviewed by unbiased scientists, which, according to what was available, had not been done yet. Elizabeth had always hid behind the excuse of not publishing by saying it would reveal trade secrets, but tried to deflect those who spoke out against Theranos and threatened legal action against anyone who published negative opinions. Then, John Carreyrou, an investigative journalist working for the Wall Street Journal, published his story. He had become interested in Holmes when an article in Fortune had done an in-depth piece about Elizabeth and Theranos. Initially, he just wanted to know more, but 2 whistleblowers confirmed suspicions in the scientific community. Theranos was a lie. The whistleblowers went on the record to say that the devices didn't work. They had first-hand knowledge of devices that had been programmed to appear to work, when in actuality, most tests were being run on third-party devices. The labs used traditional blood analyzers, which they were not licensed to do. In fact, it was discovered that Holmes had lied to the FDA, downplaying what the company had been doing. After the Wall Street Journal article came out, the FDA did a surprise visit of the facilities, which had resulted in several violations. Additionally, they also reclassified the Theranos proprietary devices as a Class II medical device, meaning that there would need to be more oversight and regulations in place. This classification change closed the loophole that Theranos had been operating in. After that, article after article critical of what was happening at the company became more than Theranos could bear. Holmes made several desperate attempts to get on top of the bad press, but they just didn't have anything substantial to dispel the critics.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I have to tell you, in all my years, I can't recall a private company that I have to candidly many have never heard of getting this kind of attention and scrutiny. What do you think's going on here?
This is what happens when you work to change things. And first they think you're crazy, then they fight you, and then all of a sudden you change the world. And I have to say, I personally was shocked to see that the Journal would publish something like this when we had sent them over 1,000 pages of documentation demonstrating that the statements in their piece were false. But we're doing things differently, and we're working to make a difference, and that means people raise questions, and that's okay. But in this case, it was pretty disappointing to see that after every single one of the sources that we spoke with, who the Journal had contacted, told us that the statements that were being attributed to them were false or misleading, and the only sources who were left were ones who wouldn't speak with us, who on their own website say that they now do business with LabCorp in their office, or in the other case, demanded in writing that we pay them in cash upfront $2,500 for an hour to talk to them about their statements to the Journal.
Did the Journal
those
know
things
what
weren't
you just
referenced.
said? Did the Journal know everything that you just said before they wrote the article?
Of course, absolutely.
Theranos started bleeding cash, and several failed attempts at generating cash were putting more pressure on the company. Safeway walked away from what was going to be a $350 million contract, which was another nail in the coffin for Theranos. Well, that is it for this video. Part 2 will be up as soon as possible, and we will go into the rest of the collapse and the trial in the next part. As always, please give this video a thumbs up if you like the content, and subscribe for more if you haven't already. Also, don't forget to turn on that notification bell so you get notified when I post. If you've done all that and want to support me and the channel, we have channel membership and Patreon to get early access, members-only content, live streams, and more. We also have merch and other goodies in the description box and links to all my socials. But until then, I will see you all in the next one. Bye for now.